Until the pandemic came and hit us, I think a lot of people were not quite so aware as to how much our lives are impacted by global events that might start anywhere.
This is a real crisis.
I mean, it's been clear that this was likely to spread in the U.S.
We need to be thinking much more ambitiously.
Climate finance is a very big issue.
We, the Center for Global Development, we're a group that try and see how we can make the international system that supports global development work more effectively.
CGD came about because it was time to focus not only on what developing countries should do, but much more on what the rich world should do.
How do we finance infrastructure in the poorest parts of the world? How do we increase productivity in agriculture? What kind of policy brings out the best outcomes?
Some of our previous work has helped to come up with a kind of innovative financing mechanism that was used to help launch pneumococcal vaccines. We really have researchers and experts here at CGD who come at these issues from multiple vantage points, and I think that's just what helps make our research more rigorous, more rich, and actually more connected to the realities that decision makers are grappling with.
We've been looking to CGD for all of your research and analysis to guide us.
So CGD is nonpartisan. Because of that, over the years, that credibility has given us significant convening power.
Our government highly values the work.
What CGD is about is you can ask those difficult questions that people refuse to ask and actually find solutions.
We're thinking about how climate change will impact migration patterns, how that will in turn have impacts on people's health.
It's challenging to be able to align budget with ambitious programmatic goals, but it can be done.
Every single time that we're able to get it right, it means we're reducing significant poverty.
If you can help to make things a little bit better, that's a good way to spend your time.
Hello, everyone. I'm Nancy Lee, Senior Policy Fellow at the Center for Global Development, and I'm delighted to welcome you all to this discussion of multilateral development finance, and in particular, the OECD's new 2022 report on the subject. I don't think I have to explain to this audience the importance of this topic, particularly at this moment. Just before COP27, a new authoritative report projected the external climate finance needs of low-income and middle-income countries at $1 trillion per year by 2030. And we know that there are many other critical development finance needs in social infrastructure, human capital, food security, and physical infrastructure. In the era of the poly-crisis, crisis spending and long-term investment must be additive, not sequential. The OECD's report released this week takes stock of that part of aid, which is channeled through multilateral institutions, the multilateral development banks, the UN system, and vertical funds. It's fitting that we should focus on these institutions. The system, though it does not operate as a coherent system all the time, as the report points out, is a unique set of institutions with the scale, tools, on-the-ground presence, experience, and knowledge suited to the array of these formidable challenges. We would have to invent it if it did not exist. But we also need to understand and address its limitations. And those limitations are not only confined to the size of the system. I certainly believe, and I've written, that the multilateral system, particularly the multilateral development banks, needs to be bigger. But it's hard to make that case unless it can also become more efficient in its use of capital and effective. As you'll hear, the report not only reviews trends in the volume of multilateral development finance, it covers allocation by institution, country income groups, sectors, and crisis versus needs. The report concludes with a series of recommendations for how to improve the system. We are very fortunate to have with us today Haje Schutte, who will give us a short presentation of an overview of the report. Haje is Senior Counselor and Head of the Financing for Sustainable Development Division of the OECD Development Cooperation Directive, and he's a former banker himself, a senior manager at KfW. I've had the pleasure of working with Haje on a number of issues, and it's always a pleasure and highly beneficial to listen to him. After Haje's presentation, we'll turn to a discussion with an excellent panel, whom I will introduce at that point, and we will be taking questions from the audience, so be thinking about any questions or issues you want to raise. So without further ado, Haje, over to you.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you, Nancy, for hosting this event, Multilateral Development Finance report. So that's a report that the OECD is producing every second year as we speak through collaborations with a number of leading think tanks. Like, say it's a basic lounge across the globe, across the day or the time to have the ability to also present it with you, Nancy, and your now colleagues. Many of you will be based in Washington. You're close observers, or at the UN in New York. So you're close observers of the discussions that the potential reform of the multilateral development finance system report comes really timely because we are in the halfway into the implementation of the agenda, but then we see that the multilateral system pressure due to the combined impact of these cascading crisis context in which we are living in. And if I could have my slide, I think that the multilateral development system is really, next one please, characterized by three fundamental paradoxes. System has never been as solicited, demanded, requested, required, needs to put it out. And at the same time, you can also say it has never been as contested. And on the left-hand side, you see the impressive response by the multilateral organization, COVID-19 pandemic. So the total volume changed, increased by the institutions committed a record 230 billion 2020. So that's an increase by 37% in compare. That is in percentage terms a little bit less than back in the global financial crisis, 2008, 2009, but in volume was the largest increase that we have seen. So you could say, yes, this has confirmed organizations to assist developing countries in terms of come up with counter-cyclical support. So that's the good news. And at the same time, multilateral organizations have never been as contested. So at the UN General Assembly back in September, or at the annual meetings of IMF, several leaders from developed countries as well as developing countries, fundamental revamping of the system in order to better serve the individual in face of new challenges such as climate, but we also talk COVID, and who knows what is coming our way anyhow. So the system not only has been challenged when it comes to the volume it is able to, but it also has been criticized in regard to its lack of effectiveness, accountability. And I think from also speaking from the perspective of the Development Assistance Committee, obviously, what we need to ensure is that in the context of resources, this growing skepticism over the multilateral approaches, undermining the willingness of governments to continue in a sustainable way, providing this support to the multilateral organization, their solutions. And can I have the next slide, please? Now, the second paradox that we see is that despite being challenged through the multilateral organization, it's not enough. The resources of the increasing needs. So what you see on the left-hand side is that the multilateral system has channeled growing volumes of ODA, 15 and 2020, the share of ODA countries through multilateral organizations has increased from 39 to 43, a significant emphasis of the multilateral organizations as the preferred channel of highly concessional funding to developing countries. And that has been largely driven, what you see here through earmarked funding. And you can say, well, there are pros and cons funding, but it probably reflects an interest of control and ability to scrutinize the funding that they are providing. On the right-hand side, and that is figures as of last week. The money is not sufficient. For example, here the UN registered a record for humanitarian assistance of 27.8 billion for financing gap basically of 55%. So very significant slide. A third fundamental paradox that we see is that the system to the new and emerging challenges may have rather to the problem and not necessarily really reduce the fundamental issues. So you see this here on the left-hand side. It's being dominated by 10 players. So basically 10 players depicted here yellow percent of total volume being provided by multilateral organizations. And that total of more than 200 multilateral organizations. And the which are constituted by smaller and more specialized entities are characterized by fragmentation. Now, we all know that in response, typically the system has grown. So there have been additional institutions and vehicles being only added to the sense of fragmentation that the total system. On the right-hand side, you see that this growing complexity of the multilateral architecture is then when it comes to getting a clear understanding of the gaps and the overlap. So the table here shows, and that's always highlighted here in red, sectors, a multiplicity, a multitude of multilateral organizations are active in the same sector. So, for example, more than 40 are active in energy or environmental protection. And that obviously might be, well, it's certainly an overlap, might reduce the effectiveness of the situation, but it's our partners in developing countries who need to navigate this very, very complex system. So, summarizing the implications is, the next slide, please. We believe that the multilateral system is basically can be depicted by two vicious circles that we need to address in order to safeguard its multilateral. What we require is really that we address these shortcomings. We obviously try to scale and reform the system. Reduce trust that I have indicated already, spoke about the shortage, relatively short, and the push for reform may lead to stakeholders facing two difficult trade-offs. On the left-hand side, you see is between dedicating resources, scarce resources, to short-term, but that may come at the expense of long-term investments into the system, kind of potentially paving the way for future crises. And on the right-hand side, growing fragmentation and the complexity of system may result once again then in an effectiveness. And this then again may fuse, in foster of mistrust in multilateral institutions. We all know, I think we all agree, business as usual is not an option. An overhaul of the system is needed. Can I have the next slide, please? What we try to point out in the report, I think we need to carefully also be careful about potential unattended or taking a too narrow perspective on this. So we know that efforts to reform the multilateral system have currently so far mainly focused its financial capacity. So the SDR reallocation, the excellent MDB capital adequacy framework, and Nancy, you were one of the impressive Bridgetown initiative, the call by Secretary of Trade, also the call by a couple of other bilateral actors. They all have basically increasing the financial firepower of the system. I think we believe that you need to take careful consideration the implications this may have. One is, for example, understanding we need to better the long-term implications of an increased reliance of MDB's financial leverage costs, and you see this depicted, whereby basically the contributions of member states to concession funding have basically stagnated. The MDB's capital market resources quite impressively. So what are the implications of this? Financing costs. We have seen an increase on average of the financing costs of the MD provided. The conditions, the capacity to continue serving. And then also, well, what are the implications of the call MDBs to fund global development agenda, global development addressing climate, the climate change through more climate finance. When it comes between concessional or non-concessional finance, as well as the allocation of finance between low and middle income countries. So I think that there's a lot of, we really appreciate the fact that there are very voices, both from developed countries, calling for rethink of the whole system. And we think this is an opportunity to grasp. So back to you, Nancy, and once again, big thank to you and your think tank.
Thanks so much, Haje. I really appreciate that frank assessment of the state of the system and the very clear identification of the challenges of fragmentation, the short-term versus long-term trade-offs, which we have to avoid, the concessional funding, stagnation, and the leverage issue. So now we're going to have a conversation, an equally frank conversation with a group of people who know a lot about the system and bring very different perspectives about it. So let me introduce them now, and then we can go through some of the issues that you raised, Haje. Amy Dodd, first, is the Policy Director for Development Economics at the One Campaign. She was formerly at Development Initiatives, Director at the UK Aid Network, and Parliamentary Advisor in the House of Commons. Michaela Gavas is co-director, a colleague of mine here at CGD, co-director of Development Cooperation in Europe, and a Senior Policy Fellow, formerly a Specialist Advisor in the House of Commons, and head of the Overseas Development Institute's Development Strategy and Finance Program. And Karen Matheson is Senior Program Officer for Development Policy and Advocacy at the Gates Foundation, and was formerly Acting U.S. Executive Director at the World Bank and Director of the Office of Multilateral Development Banks at the U.S. Treasury, where we worked for many years together. So let's plunge in. Karen, let me start with you. As the report notes, the multilateral development finance institutions are seeking to diversify their funding sources, and they want to include both philanthropic and commercial private actors. So you're at the Gates Foundation. Tell us how the Gates Foundation makes its decisions about channeling its funding through these institutions, and what lessons the foundation has drawn from its experience so far, and what does it want to see in potential partners going forward as a very important actor on the development finance scene.
Yep, thank you very much, Nancy. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. So yeah, let me talk for a minute about Gates Foundation, which I did notice in the report actually received, was the one sort of non-sovereign actor to receive special mention because we are so large with a endowment of over 50 billion. So essentially, decisions are driven, I think, first and foremost by the priority areas that are set within the foundation. And that's mostly health. That probably won't surprise anyone since we started with a big focus on health. But that focus really has evolved over time to include maternal and child health care, nutrition, agriculture, a lot around women's economic empowerment, and within that, financial inclusion. So for each of these areas, we will have a strategy that is kind of updated every 2 to 3 years. So then the next question in terms of funding is, well, can we find a partner that has a strategic focus that aligns with our interests? Technology, again, will not surprise you given the founders of the organization, that technology is will be a strong common thread. So for example, looking at agriculture, what is the best technology for agriculture modernization, be it seeds, be it irrigation practices, and so forth. Digital certainly is a tool that we tend to look across all these areas to see if we can use. Then there's the question of the where. We really do focus on the low-income countries, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, as one would expect, but also have an office in India and do some work in South Asia. Then the who question, and I think this is what a lot of people are always interested in. How do we decide who our partners are going to be? So, the first issue is, well, do they align with these issues and geographies? And then the second is their capacity. What kind of capacity do they have to implement? Of course, reputation. And so not surprisingly, you will find that we work with a lot of the big MDBs. And indeed, the World Bank is a very big, very important implementing partner. But we do go from big to small. We also have a number of major legacy programs, which the report notes as well. There is a bit of a focus, not a bit, there's a real focus on the vertical funding, with the Global Fund and Gavi being two very, very big examples. And, I think it's notable that the report points out, of course, that vertical funding suits donors quite well in terms of delivering on the very specific goals that we have, but maybe less well for the borrowers. So some of the lessons. So one lesson is, how do we influence some of the bigger mobilization organizations or efforts? So IDA is a really good example. The Gates Foundation is not a member of, some of these well-established entities and cannot support them directly. But we do support them indirectly. We supported the GFF for IDA to help, again, support child maternal health. And in the last round, we helped set up actually a new facility that would be, that is being dispersed through IDA to help address childcare constraints that became so evident during COVID, largely through early education programs. So that's been one piece. How can you as a new, relatively new player and not a sovereign player, have influence over some of these more established programs. The second is, can we do better on localization and diversification? And this is something a lot of donors are thinking hard about. So we do right now have a goal that is throughout the foundation to nurture more partners in the South. And we're very serious about that goal, but it does take time. And that includes a commitment to capacity building, because a lot of them can only absorb very small amounts of funding. So I would say over the next 3 to 5 years, that's where you're going to see some real shifts. So let me stop there, Nancy, see if you have any questions or you want to move on to another speaker.
Yeah, thanks, Karen. That's a good overview and a good description of part of the dilemma, which is to really focus on these particular strategic priorities of the Gates Foundation. You need to make sure that entities are going to act in the areas you're interested in. On the other hand, that tends to push the system toward vertical funds or some thematic funds, which then can result in the fragmentation that Haje was just talking about. So, and this is the very real challenge right now on climate finance, because there's sort of one set of people who are talking about creating climate banks, and another set of people saying that it needs to be integrated into the existing multilateral development banks and systems. So, Mikhail, let me turn to you on fragmentation. The report is very frank in saying that the system lacks a whole of system accountability. And from your perspective on the European side, tell us how the European countries are using the multilateral system and how are they impacting fragmentation, either positively or negatively.
Great. Thank you very much, Nancy. And thank you, Haje, for a really comprehensive overview of the state of the system. Just before I talk about the European contribution, let me just say one thing that struck me. I mean, so COVID-19 really presented a key juncture to accelerate the move towards more multilateral action in supporting global development outcomes. I mean, we know that the pandemic not only presented an urgent transboundary challenge, but it also became an acute development crisis, undoing many years of progress towards poverty eradication. Now, the multilateral system was created precisely to address these situations. And yet, although Haje showed how the volume of multilateral finance has increased substantially, it's striking how the share of ODA allocated as core support to the multilateral system by DAC donors has remained stable at around 27% of gross ODA disbursements. And that's quite telling, really. So let me just look at the European contribution to the system. So I think it's 11 EU countries out of 19 who report to the DAC channel more than half of their aid through the multilateral system as core support. And these are countries like Finland, Austria, Belgium, Spain, Slovenia. Generally, it's the smaller member states that tend to favor multilateral channels to disperse their ODA. And this is partly as a result of lower levels of capacity. Now, EU member states' core contributions to multilateral institutions actually increased from around 25.5 billion in 2019 to 28 billion in 2020. But again, this is proportionally less in comparison to bilateral aid, which increased from around 66.7 billion to 82 billion. But then if you look at earmarked contributions, they've also increased from 8.5 billion in 2019 to 11.3 billion in 2020. Now, obviously, most European DAC donors channel most of their multilateral aid through the European institutions. That's obvious, but then that's followed by the World Bank, the Green Climate Fund, and the Global Fund. Looking very briefly at this issue of earmarking, I mean, there is a wide variation of earmarking among EU member states. So Germany earmarks almost half of its multilateral assistance. And Germany is followed by Denmark, the Netherlands, Sweden, Luxembourg, Finland, Ireland, Austria, and France just under 20%. Now, again, the smaller member states tend to earmark much less. And probably the largest recipient of EU DAC donor earmark funding is the World Food Programme, followed by the World Bank and then UNDP. Just a word about the fragmentation of the system. I think, the fragmentation derives from the stresses that the system has endured and actually continues to suffer from. And, Haje told us some of those stresses. I mean, the fact that shareholders of multilateral organizations have actually struggled to accommodate the shifts in the balance of power. The pace of reform has been too slow. And so we have parallel institutions, regional or informal alternatives and coalitions of the willing, which have emerged as have new models for financing global challenges through mechanisms that pool and allocate global resources. But it's these alternatives that can take quick and concerted action. However, on the other hand, there's also an argument to say that the problem lies not only in the multilateral institutions themselves, but in the shareholders. And it's this opposition that exists between putting one's own country first and then multilateral cooperation. And for donors who are, more and more espousing narratives of national or mutual interests in the provision of global public goods, this would, in fact, suggest greater use of bilateral channels or multi-buy earmarked channels that are perhaps better conduits for seeking control, for accountability, visibility, and measurable value for money from their aid programs. But if you look at the climate finance area in particular, I mean, European policymakers are increasingly looking to supplement the UNFCCC's collective approach. And they're doing this with further initiatives developed among smaller groups of like-minded states, such as, the Loss and Damage Fund, the Breakthrough Agenda, which we talked about, and the Climate Club. This is, that Germany put forward during its presidency of the G7. But this is also happening within the European context specifically itself. If you look at Team Europe initiatives, these are essentially coalitions of the willing of, EU member states coming together. So, for example, you've got the EU recently announced the launch of 2 global gateway flagship initiatives on water, energy, and climate, and then on digital connectivity. And this is essentially made up of the EU, 7 member states, the EIB, and the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. And they're all going to pool their contributions together. So by mixing collective and like-minded initiatives, I think the Europeans are adopting a kind of twin-track strategy on multilateral cooperation. I mean, they don't assume or require multilateral initiatives, to have universal memberships, nor do they push for a pick and choose transactional plurilateralism. Rather, they're calling for alliances and partnerships of like-minded states based on values that work hand in hand with interests. But in the absence of the most important fundamental global public good, which is a functioning world order, I think regionalism is certainly a growing arena for minilateral forms of cooperation. Thanks, Nancy.
Thanks. That's a great overview, Michaela. sort of explanation of the sort of conflicting forces that are shaping the system, and the notion of forming partnerships as opposed to trying to enforce a division of labor across institutions, forming partnerships around the same common objectives does seem to be the way that the system has to evolve. But collaboration across the institutions is, of course, at the core of the problem. So there doesn't seem to be a structure that's strong enough to incentivize the institutions to collaborate. Maybe Europe can lead the way on this. So Amy, turning to you and sort of pushing forward with another set of trade-offs, and people have already alluded to it. We have the pandemic, we have Russia's war on Ukraine, as has already been mentioned, 75 to 95 million more people living in extreme poverty. So you have this regression in progress on poverty, and at the same time, as Michaela mentioned, this enhanced interest in global public goods, fighting climate change, and also pandemic preparedness. So there is a very active debate about how to bring those two things together. And so one campaign is sort of at the center of these conversations in civil society. How do you view that debate, and what direction would you like it to move in?
Thanks, Nancy. And yeah, I would echo thanks for the report. It's a very interesting read and a lot to sort of unpack in there as well. I hope this doesn't sound like dodging the question, but I think we can't kind of see it as a trade-off. We can't pick and choose. I don't think I need to tell anyone on this panel, or I'm assuming many of the people in the audience, like you were talking, Nancy, about sort of growing climate finance needs. And we know the cost of not doing that. The less we do, the more expensive it's going to be as time goes on, including in rich countries, in donor countries as well. Extreme weather events are more expensive. All of those kind of climate costs are sort of piling up on us. We know we need to spend more money on development and poverty eradication, as you're saying, sort of poverty is going up. But again, we also sort of know, and I was thinking of what you were saying, Michaela, about the kind of national interest piece. A sort of obvious example to me is, that sort of cost to us exists as well outside of just, a direct kind of funding things. If we look at, what happened with the debt crisis in Sri Lanka, that has really obvious effects on stability and security, which again have knock-on effects for the rest of the economy. Food security and the kind of hunger crisis and what's happening to the kind of price of food for all of us in all sorts of different countries means we do need to be investing in, yes, climate and agriculture. So it sort of feels like a false dichotomy. We can't afford to kind of pick and choose. So we know we need to do two things then, right? We need to kind of substantially increase the pie. And Haje, you mentioned things like how do we kind of reform the MDBs, and the report that you worked on, Nancy, for the G20 about how we leverage a lot more out of, MDB's existing capitalization, which isn't all going to be concessional finance, obviously, but it does allow us to kind of change the equation in terms of how much money we have to spend on different things in different countries. I guess that would be the other one that we sort of seen. We've talked about it in this report. There's that trade-off between climate and development to some extent, and also that trade-off kind of middle income to low income countries, to put it somewhat simplistically. So I guess, thinking very much about the win-wins where they do exist, and there are a bunch of them. I do find this kind of climate versus development thing gets a little bit, people sort of get entrenched in their ideas about how you have to spend money in a certain way on a certain set of things. But the idea that we can't find those places where there are win-wins and then really invest in them. So adaptive infrastructure, investments in ideally green and renewable, obviously, but just thinking about kind of energy access, those are all going to have economic, human, and climate benefits. So whilst there's not always things that are always win-wins, and there are some trade-offs in places where we probably need to make some hard decisions, I think those decisions get a lot easier if we can grow the pie, if we can manage things, and you've all talked about them around the sort of fragmentation and duplication in the system. That's also going to have some definite benefits. And I guess, thinking much more about that investing in resilience. And I find that one a really tricky one, because obviously the urgency of investing in the things that we have to do short-term is really human, and it's really in front of your face, and it's really hard to not respond to. And I'm not really suggesting we shouldn't respond to it, but we do have to be thinking about, do we have the right balance between short-term response and actually investing in sort of building resilience? And I think you pulled it out when you were talking about it, Haje, but this, we sort of get stuck in this vicious circle instead of thinking a little bit more holistically. So I'm not sure I have a sort of perfect answer to it, but I guess what we're really saying is, you know, we need to stop thinking about it as just one thing or the other, but grow the pie, make better use of the resources, and yeah, think about where we can kind of get some, what is it, the UK government called it for a long time, co-benefits, was a bit of a catchphrase for a while, which was maybe less snappy than it could have been.
Thanks, Amy. And I like the way you framed it, that there are costs, of course, to these short and long-term investments, but the costs of failing to make these short and long-term investments are larger. So instead of focusing on how expensive it is to make the pie bigger, it probably would be useful for us to focus more on how expensive it is to fail to make these investments. I think that's a useful way to frame it. So let's push a little bit further into the reform of the multilateral development banks, the MDBs. And I'm turning back to you, Karen. And that has a lot to do with making the pie bigger. So, and there are kind of two aspects of this at the moment, well, three really. One is making more efficient use of current capital. The second really has to do with the case for adding capital to these institutions. And the third is reforming how they work and what they do to better meet the needs. So the foundation has been a strong supporter of implementation of these recommendations from the Capital Adequacy Review that was commissioned by the G20, which could have major benefits in terms of MDB lending capacity. So maybe you could say a few words about why the foundation thinks that effort is so important. And if you care to opine at all on the question of general capital increases for the institutions, please feel free.
Okay. Well, I am also going to take just a little step back on the trade-off issue, because as a former Treasury person, it is hard for me not to see the world of finance without thinking about trade-offs. And of course, the cost of inaction point is critical. But, you know, we do face an existential climate crisis. The cost of not doing something is the planet. And even so, we're not where we need to be, right? So I think that as a result, we really have to focus on expanding the pie. So in that sense, the prescription I share with others, that is really what we need to do: expand the pie as much as possible, so there is less of a perception of trade-offs. So this is a really good way to do that. In fact, I think it's a really exceptional opportunity. And the report that you and your colleagues worked on, Nancy, I think is going to be pretty significant. I only pause because there have been two previous efforts. They were not so successful, but this is the first time that an independent panel of experts was asked to do something. And then it's really been able to get out there and socialize it with all kinds of stakeholders. And then as a result, you really see it reflected back in a lot of key channels, including the G20, including the Bridgetown Agenda, including COP, the roadmap that the World Bank itself has committed to provide. So I think these are very promising signs. So for us, another way to motivate change was to set up this new facility, which we have done with two other entities, to invite stakeholders to elaborate on how they could take these recommendations and operationalize them, and really, get into some of the challenges of, what are obstacles to any of these various issues, and how can they be addressed? How can we flesh out questions that were raised, like the default rates that are so much lower in reality than they are as reflected in the credit rating agency methodologies. how can we accurately understand the value of a preferred creditor status? How can we get access to some of the private sector data to help inform private sector data amongst these DFIs that could help inform the actual private sector? So there are a lot of interesting proposals that I think have tremendous potential. And then, Nancy, as you yourself said, the upside really is huge. I mean, if you could stretch the whole system by just 10%, which is, I think a very even modest goal, that would give you another 50 billion in capital, and that could leverage 150 to 250 billion. And then that's real money. And it's all additional. You're not displacing anyone. So just a couple of questions before I close. One is, I think there's a presumption among donors that this would support the GPGs. And we need to have more of a conversation with the middle income borrowers in particular. Is that what they want? Is that where the demand will be? And then the second is the LICs, who will not directly benefit from this unless there's a pile of additional grant funding to concessionalize this. So is there a way to do that? So those are a couple of things that are top of mind for us as we move forward with this challenge fund. Thank you, Nancy.
Thanks, Karen. And I obviously, as a member of the panel, I completely agree with your characterization of the potential, which really does not require, very an exaggerated assessment of, how much more lending can be supported by the existing capital, and does not require any or does not involve any threat to the credit ratings of the institutions, which are so important. And we know that in part because of the credit rating agencies themselves have welcomed the report and said it will not involve downgrades. So these are steps that shareholders, G20 shareholders and other shareholders can take in the near future. So in the midst of all of these challenges we've been talking about, this is a pretty efficient way to try to make the pie bigger. So now I want to turn back to Michaela and raise, the fallout from the war in Ukraine. And we've already alluded to the increase in extreme poverty, but the war in Ukraine also has implications for European countries, for European donors, European neighbors of Ukraine, and European donors in particular. They themselves have difficult fiscal situations, and they've cut their aid budgets in the midst of those fiscal stresses. So now the kind of conflicting forces are even more apparent. So what is your view about, you started to describe before the allocation of aid between bilateral and multilateral institutions. What is the best way, if you could, elaborate the allocation of aid between bilateral and multilateral institutions? What would that involve in your view?
Great, thanks, Nancy. Yeah, I mean, it's the direction of travel is not looking great. You said several countries have announced a significant scaling back in their development aid. There's a lot of a redirection of spending happening. So aid spending on in-donor refugee costs are, shooting through the roof. And as I mentioned before, despite their clear comparative advantage in addressing global challenges, the share of funds allocated to the multilateral system has not seen any substantive increase. And on the contrary, as Haje showed, a number of them have borne the brunt of some of the bilateral aid cuts and will continue to do so in the future. I mean, with regards to the European donors, it's quite hard to give a consistent picture, but from what we can tell from strategies and projections, so Germany's multilateral contributions will decline from now until 2024. But then they're projected to increase back to the current level. This year was an exceptional year for Sweden with an increase in multilateral spending from 2021. But going forward, again, Sweden's contributions are projected to decline. But then you have countries like France, on the other hand. So France is projecting a very large increase to financial institutions in particular and multilateral development banks, but a decrease to other agencies like the UN. And then the Netherlands is looking to actually increase its overall multilateral allocation. So it's a varied picture. But I think at the end of the day, all donors really need to ask themselves how better to address global challenges that extend beyond their national boundaries, as well as local challenges, poverty, inequality, how they work more intensively and effectively in difficult environments, including in fragile states. So, I mean, the way I see it is institutional fitness as a donor in today's and tomorrow's world will actually derive from embracing global public goods as well as country-based operations. And so this suggests the dual use of both multilateral and bilateral channels because of this simultaneous orientation towards global engagement and country-based operations. But at the end of the day, they face three choices. So the first is really the continuation of the current trajectory, where they prioritize short-term national interest, bilateral action, including when faced with global crises. So under this model, development cooperation essentially remains driven by competition between countries and underinvestment in the multilateral system to the detriment of global public goods. The second choice involves it could involve the emergence of a much stronger Southern cooperation platform as a challenge to the failure of DAC countries and multilateral institutions to do more to overcome inequalities and support global development outcomes. There are multiple risks of this, but the main is that this sort of provides the potential to deepen divisions between North and South. Through cooperation initiatives that, in fact, fail to bridge the divide. And then there's the third choice, which involves, if you like, a rethinking of the narratives of national interest, self-interest, from the perspective of a global development paradigm, which essentially understands that cooperation on global problems is in the interests of all countries. And under this path, I mean, the imperative for cooperation would then require the creation of new and, existing, but also new spaces for collaboration and many more ways to pool and allocate resources in response to crises. But my sense is that Europe on the whole still veers largely towards the view of resuscitate and reinforce the multilateral system, as opposed to overhaul that Haje mentioned. I mean, there are many who argue, including in the South, that the multilateral system does need a major overhaul in order to become more inclusive, more transparent, more accountable. But I do think the Europeans see it from the view of, how to, if you like, revive and reinforce the system. But just then one final point in terms of, what is this optimal division of labor between bilateral and multilateral? The thing is, there is no one size fits all. I mean, it's path dependency, politics, purpose, strategic objectives, volume, as I've shown, capacity. All of this plays a role in, decisions about allocation. But, this simultaneous orientation towards global engagement as well as country-based operations suggests, as I said, the dual use of both multilateral and bilateral channels.
Thanks. That's a really interesting way to frame it. First of all, it's heartening to hear that Europe is not retreating from its commitment to multilateral institutions, and I guess you could probably conclude that precisely because these shocks and conflict in other countries are being brought home to them, literally by the migration of people. Their interest in the multilateral institutions is even strengthened. But I liked another point you made, which is really we should be thinking about which institutions, bilateral and multilateral, actually demonstrate the greatest competency and effectiveness in bringing both local poverty-related, SDG-related challenges together with investments in global public goods, which institutions are best at it. And that really should drive allocation, which means I think we need to expect more from the institutions in terms of reporting their impact on a consistent basis across institutions. So Amy, now one other sort of allocation issue that's raised by the report is the allocation of aid between low-income countries and middle-income countries. And as the report notes, low-income countries still receive, something a little less than 20% of aid through multilateral institutions. And I know this has been an interest of yours for a long time. Middle-income countries are likely to actually receive more concessional aid in the future as we try to incentivize them to invest more in global public goods. So it does not look at this stage that poor countries are going to receive more aid. And as Karen mentioned, the stretching the capital of the multilateral development banks has to do with their payment issues. It doesn't have to do with their concessional. So we're still in a situation where donors have to step up on concessional finance, which is hard for them. So, and this is, again, a debate that one is very much engaged in. How would you characterize the problem and the solution?
So I guess I'm in an interesting context for this conversation. I'm based in the UK, for those who don't know me. And obviously the UK government is making some interesting choices at the moment in terms of how it's spending its money, including a big shift actually as a donor who traditionally did proportionally more multilateral financing compared to bilateral. They're actually shifting the other way, which I think is a sort of concerning trend. But I guess looking at I see the multilateral piece as well, like really in the context of the bilateral trends. So we talked, Michaela, you were mentioning, much more spending on in-donor refugee costs and other money that never really leaves the donor country. But if you look at bilateral ODA as well, LDCs or low-income countries are broadly speaking getting a shrinking proportion of that budget over time. So I think we've got these kind of there's probably way more than double, but these two pressures are kind of pushing down the financing that's going to the poorest countries. And yeah, we know the kind of impact of, the war in Ukraine is going to be quite significant. Some of my colleagues have been working on trying to track what, bilateral donors are spending on refugee costs, and it could be like $50 billion this year. So the impact of that on kind of financing for countries, I think, is going to be really quite concerning. I think in that sense we do, and maybe this is one of those sort of difficult decisions, we do have to make some kind of tough choices. I think it's a huge generalization, but middle-income countries are, broadly speaking, more able to self-finance investments in development or climate change, or they are more able to access and sustain, debt-creating instruments like the hard windows at MDBs. So I think we do need to be a little bit sharp in kind of how we use those limited ODA resources. I know we're seeing sort of shrinking money, broadly speaking, to the concessional bits of the MDBs, although it was I know we all wanted to see more into IDA last year, but it was the largest replenishment ever. So it does go to show that we can actually make that case and sort of leverage that money. And so I guess part of it is just, advocating to donors in terms of how they work on that. It'll be interesting to see, I suppose, how that goes over the next couple of years, because I feel like budgets are probably more constrained than they have been in a little while. But I guess it goes back to what I was saying before. It is kind of, if we've got a pie and we're trying to grow it through things like, the MDB capital adequacy reforms, that allows us to make some of those tough decisions about saying, well, we need to be focusing then those concessional resources much, much more tightly on the places that sort of need it most. I guess I see other things as well where we can be focusing on how we can create additional finance. The One Campaign has worked for a very long time on debt and debt relief. There's no question in my mind that's one of the biggest constraints to low-income countries' sort of fiscal space, their capacity to spend money on the things that are important. We're 2 years into the common framework on debt, and it's just not working, which I think, frankly, we should all be a little bit ashamed of. Multilaterals are a little constrained in that context. They're not going to be doing a lot of debt forgiveness, obviously, but thinking about how they can kind of restructure or reprofile, how can they support countries with much more sort of immediate liquidity when they apply to the common framework? What can they do to incentivize and build better sort of coordination, like sharing things like the debt sustainability assessments, everyone's kind of working on the same page. Where can they lean on and invest in that coordination between the private sector, China, multilaterals, and all the other bits of the system? The other one I wonder about is, we all worked on this a lot over the last couple of years. So SDRs, the special drawing rights, where we had a sort of special allocation back in 2021. Some 400 billion of that went to advanced economies. We've recycled about, or are in the process of recycling about 60 billion of that. So that means there's some 300 plus billion sitting on rich countries' balance sheets, mostly unused in central banks. And I do kind of wonder, again, thinking about the multilateral system, how could we be using that money to increase the sort of capital or increase the resources that MDBs have available? I know the African Development Bank is doing a lot of work on trying to find or working on sort of solutions to kind of recycle those SDRs to use them in hybrid capital instruments, which I think could be really interesting. And it'd be great to see more banks coming along with that, and also more donor countries, I think, putting money in. I know there's some challenges in sort of how that's done and whether or not that can be entirely concessional as we'd like it to be. But again, I guess in a sort of context of rising interest rates and debt challenges, long-term, patient, cheaper MDB debt does feel like at least a sort of semi-concessional, even if it's not odorable in that sense. It feels like it sort of needs to be part of the solution. So yeah, I guess I'd say those sort of big bits that we're going to be focusing on over the next year.
Yeah, I'm really glad you raised the external debt service issue as a way to expand fiscal space, which is what particularly in poor countries, which is what additional concessional finance would do. And of course, the problems with the common framework are well known, as you point out. And there is this kind of impasse at this point between various creditors. Private sector is not participating or didn't participate in that sustainability suspension initiative. So there's really a struggle between the creditors about what comparable treatment now means. And there are some who argue that the multilateral development banks themselves should participate in debt relief, but that would involve concessional finance, as the HIPC and MDRI experience. There has to be some way to compensate the multilateral development banks if they write off debt. So those who argue that MDB should be included in debt restructuring and write-offs need to be prepared to come forward with some concessional finance to help pay for it. So, and also let me agree with you on SDRs has to be part of the mix as well. And our colleague at CGD, Mark Plan, has been writing a lot about this, and there are proposals out there for using SDRs in ways that can expand MDB lending. Mark just published a piece on how you might use SDRs for investments of hybrid capital in the MDBs, which in turn could support additional lending. And so again, we need to be creative about how that might be done. And I think One Campaign and others outside the institutions are really important voices for keeping this on the agenda. We have a question from the audience that I just wanted to highlight for people, and also please, audience members, if you have additional questions, feel free. This is the moment where we're going to turn to them. The question is, what impact will Chinese development finance, both ODA-related and non-ODA-related, have on multilateral finance? So this is really an important issue. China has become a major actor in the development finance space, both through its bilateral institutions and by helping to create new institutions such as AIIB and the New Development Bank. So what, does anyone want to take up that question? Hi, I might turn to you to see how that was included in the report. And what we know about that data.
Just to say, I think we obviously all know about it. We all know that China is a major player. We know this from done a couple of country case studies where we saw the massive important funding one way or the other. But as we all know, coming quite often in a non-sovereign format, enterprise to enterprise form, and it's not being tracked by the statistical, and that's the reason why China's influence is not proper, in the report to the extent we would like to have. But that's something I think we probably need to collectively work on. As you know, this supporting the development measurement framework called TUSD tries to capture and aims to capture also the data and by South-South cooperation actors, most notably China. We're making slow now accepted and as part of the SDG indicator one, but it's slow. From the OECD perspective, we could make more progress on that side.
Yeah, Karen, go ahead, please.
Thanks. Just a couple of thoughts on this. I think, look, it's in our interest to bring China into the multilateral system as much as possible. And they have indeed started contributing to IDA, for example. But this is a really good example of what Michaela was talking about. These institutions, governance structures are somewhat outdated. And so then that becomes a challenge for China. I mean, I think they joined the IDB with a 0 point something share, right? And that's obviously that is a problem when you're trying to have a governance system that has some reflection in reality. But I'm using this because I didn't get to your other question, Nancy, about capital increase. And so if you look at the World Banks, if the World Banks indicates, they can do more to stretch the balance sheet if it's commensurate with a capital increase because of the show of shareholder support, you will inevitably come to the question of voice. Because whenever there's a capital increase, there's also a negotiation around shares, voice and vote, as we would call it. And, China continues to be underrepresented according even to the formula that the shareholders have adopted. So I think that is that will certainly create some complications in this current time of exceptional geopolitical tension in moving forward on that. And then my final thought is, on China, I really think whatever we can do on the transparency and accountability side is, for me, would be the top priority, is just having a better understanding of where the flows are going and on what terms. And my understanding is that even within China, there's so many entities that it's difficult to get a handle on that number. But I know CGD has certainly tried as hard as any think tank to get some insight into that. So thanks.
Yeah, I agree that the voice and vote issue is very much wrapped up in this. And if there's an IMF quoted discussion, the same will apply. So I don't think there's a way for the world to avoid these difficult issues. I would just add for China, most of its development finance has not been concessional.
Mm-hmm.
My colleague Scott Morris has written a lot about this, the terms of debt contracts. And so the debt service, the resulting debt service adds significantly to debt sustainability problems, which is reflected now in China's decisions with respect to development finance, including for infrastructure in highly indebted low-income countries. That's being reflected in a pullback in China's finance. So, but China has stepped up over time, increasingly in IDA, to contribute to concessional pools. So you could imagine an opportunity for China to step up in a big way for a climate finance concessional pool, where it would contribute both to mitigation and adaptation investments, and where it could play a very large role in the governance of that pool of finance, because it would be separate from the shareholding structure of the World Bank or another MDB. So I think there is an opportunity for China to help create something in the multilateral system that's concessional, but also allows it to play the very significant role it should be playing as a source of finance and as a leader in promoting the fight against climate change. So, okay, we have one more quick question about whether there are other non-DAC donors that are approaching development finance in novel ways. Again, turning to you, Haje, outside the DAC system, maybe again, this is where your data are not as strong. Are you seeing some non-DAC donors that are becoming more prominent and taking more of a leadership role?
Yeah, we are collecting about data. There's 130 different players. The 31 DAC members. Then there are about what we refer to as 30 non-DAC providers, and then about 45 philanthropic organizations. That is to say that an impressive array of institutions out there. And just to say, we see Islamic finance, I think, with quite a number of interesting innovations taking place. I think Indonesia is obviously presidency very much step up its visibility and its act. You met at the Bali Summit just 2 weeks ago. They launched the Global Blended Finance platform that they would like to combine funding with capacity building and also I think we see, and obviously overall the South providers, and in the G20 we have now Indonesia, followed by India. India is pushing the G20 presidency to the extent we know it now, and then followed up by Brazil and South. I see a strong push by some key actors in towards more innovation in the global development finance architecture.
Thanks, Haje. And then Michaela, did you want to add something?
Yeah, thanks, Nancy. We've looked at some of the figures for the non-DACs. These are the non-DACs who report to the DAC. And interestingly, what we found was that, that like DAC countries, non-DACs also prioritize bilateral channels. But they do it to a different degree. So, if the DAC countries contribute about 57% of their ODA as bilateral, it's 85% for non-DACs. So their contributions to the multilateral system is obviously much, much less. But I would say that the relative share of spending allocated as core multilateral contributions from non-DACs rose slightly from 7% of total ODA in 2018-2019 to 10% in 2020, which is interesting. But at the same time, their earmarked funding, so the earmarked funding from non-DACs, declined in 2020 from 8% of total ODA in 2018 to 2019 to almost 5% in 2020. So we see sort of a diverging pattern to what's happening with the DACs.
That's interesting, and perhaps the non-DAC donors can play a growing role over time in kind of reinvigorating the multilateral system if they're earmarking less and putting more of their money into multilateral institutions over time. But of course, the multilateral institutions have to demonstrate that they merit that increased focus. We're just at time now, and but I want to take just a minute each, if you could, to answer just a basic question I have to all of you, which is, if you had control over aid budgets, significant aid budgets, where would you put your money at this point? What, either countries or institutions or sectors? So don't need to go into detail, but a minute each. Let's reverse the order and start with Amy, then Michaela, and then Karen, and then Haje, I'm going to give you the last word.
Thanks, Nancy. This is actually a surprisingly hard question to answer. If you could do anything, there's so many options on the table. I guess what I would say is thinking very much about, what is it countries want and need? And maybe it goes to the last question, thinking speed, thinking responsiveness, thinking about sort of supporting, fiscal space that we've talked about, having power and say. And instinctively, there's a bit of me that wants to say we should just be handing it over to countries to spend on their kind of priorities. But if we're talking about where we put it in the multilateral system, I guess linking to my point earlier about debt, I would think about the MDBs and then basically sort of using that to kind of pay down or buy down the more expensive debt that countries are sitting on. That would be mine.
Good. Karen. Oh, I'm sorry, Michaela next.
Okay, thanks, Nancy. Well, I'm going to have my cake and eat it with this one because, on the one hand, I am an ardent internationalist or multilateralist, but I also recognize the sort of the comparative advantages of bilateral assistance as well. So I think, if I have three objectives, it would be one, solve some of the systemic global challenges and seek international solutions to globalized problems. And therefore, that would call for a strong focus on, on the delivering the changes to the rules, the agreements, the norms, and the institutions themselves, the multilateral institutions. But more than a financial commitment here, I would put my political and social capital into the multilateral system as a whole. So that would be things, or organizations like the UN actually here, pushing for that reform agenda. Secondly, global public goods. I'd focus on the regional development banks. where I see, these institutions can mobilize funding, aggregate specialized expertise, and really promote a regional agenda. And then thirdly, if, with the imperative of leaving no one behind, of reducing economic marginalization, inequality, and so on, I'd put the money bilaterally.
Got it. Thanks, Mikhailo. Karen.
Thanks. Again, given my background from Treasury, I think efficiency and value for money. So I'm very committed to the multilateral channel for sure. So agree on that. I would really like to double down on the licks because I am very concerned about this erosion of trust and credibility that's becoming more and more evident. And a big reason for that, as I understand it, is the sense that donors have really failed countries that are most affected by external shocks to deal with them. Whereas, we've been very robust in supporting Ukraine, much less so in supporting countries that are really struggling to manage these big shocks, food, fuel, and food. So would really want to double down on that. And then the third thing would be gender. We talk a lot about we want to give countries what they want, and that's the right policy and ownership. But of course, women have so little agency in a lot of these countries. And when I looked through the report, and there was this little piece about effectiveness and the perception of declining donor effectiveness, the report said that it was particularly true for gender, and I agree. And I think that is a real problem. And it is something that, if it can be addressed, can really move the needle on all the other SDGs. So those are my thoughts, Nancy.
Okay, these are all good thoughts, but they're different thoughts. So,
well, what did you expect? It's good.
Okay, Haje, where would you? I know you're speaking personally, not for the OECD. Where would you put your money?
No, frankly, I think we need to make the system fit for purpose. I think that's the bottom line. I think, as Karen was saying, we have to fix it. There is no alternative. As Nancy alluded to, we have some policy recommendations, especially for our shareholders, that are basically dealing with three issues. One is develop a holistic vision for the multilateral system, provide a strategy to have sustainable funding going towards the multilateral system, and then coordinate better. So what I would do is I would put out this huge pot of money to the system and say, listen, these are our three objectives. And whoever best kind of lives up to this and provides holistic solutions get a very, very substantial part of the money. And I think then we will see a reduction of the fragmentation and probably also an addressing of the issues of accountability and effectiveness that we spoke earlier about.
Yeah. Good. I'm glad you ended with the reference to the recommendations. I just wanted to mention that Nathan Kaplan in our audience is really highlighting the importance of governance reform in these institutions, which I totally agree with, including voice and vote, but not just voice and vote, other things as well having to do with accountability and effectiveness that Haje was just talking about. Just to answer my own question, I would say I certainly agree with Karen and others. Well, these multilateral institutions are the best we have. They just need to be better. So I would focus money on institutions that measure outcomes and report outcomes. So I know whether I'm getting value for money. I would focus it on institutions that are good at infrastructure, because so much of the agenda has to do, social agenda and global public goods agenda has to do with infrastructure, and not all of these institutions are good at infrastructure. And I would focus on institutions that can bring their financial tools together with their policy and institutional and technical assistance tools, because effectiveness really depends on that. And not all of these institutions bring these tools together. So thank you all so much for a really excellent conversation. I hope it's helpful to you, Haje, as
Absolutely.
report, and we do all thank you for this frank and rich report that reveals the state of these institutions and where they're falling short, as well as where they're putting their money. So very grateful to be able to have this conversation and bring in this larger audience. And thanks everybody in the audience for participating and also hanging in with us as we went over time. Thanks so much, everybody.